When I tell you this story, I want you to imagine it as if you are sitting with someone who has lived it, someone who has carried the weight of it quietly for years and has finally decided to let the truth come out. It's not a dramatic story in the way people often think about revenge. There are no raised voices, no impulsive decisions, no grand confrontations in front of crowds. Instead, it is a story of patience, of quiet pain that slowly transforms into a quiet strength, and of how one woman, after being betrayed by the person she loved and trusted the most, found her own way to even the scales, not with rage, but with calmness. It begins in a small town, not one of those bustling, anonymous places where neighbors barely know each other, but the kind of town where everyone's door is familiar and everyone's story is quietly known. In that town lived a girl named Sana. She wasn't just any sister. She was the kind of sister people point to when they want to describe loyalty, sacrifice, and love that goes beyond the ordinary. From a very young age, she had stepped into shoes that were far bigger than hers. Her parents had both passed away early, leaving her and her younger brother Imran to face the world together. She was still in her teens at that time, barely old enough to think about her own life, yet she took responsibility without hesitation. She worked small jobs, tutored children, stitched clothes for neighbors, and somehow managed to put food on the table while keeping her brother in school. Everything she did was built around him, as though her own existence had been rewritten to center on his survival and success. Imran, for his part, grew up watching her sacrifices. At first, he seemed to notice them. When he was young, he would often say, "One day, Appa, when I'm older, I'll take care of you the way you've taken care of me." Those words used to bring a kind of warmth to her heart. She believed them. She believed him. And in those long, lonely nights when the weight of the world felt heavier than her small shoulders could carry, she repeated those words to herself like a prayer. One day, it will be different. One day, Imran will stand by me the way I stand by him. Years passed. Sana grew into a quiet, graceful woman. She never married, though proposals came, because in her mind she had one responsibility and one responsibility only: to see her brother educated, secure, and standing tall in the world. Her own dreams, a home of her own, children perhaps, or even just the freedom to think about herself, were tucked away in a corner of her heart where no one could see them. Imran did succeed. He was bright, ambitious, and carried the confidence that comes from knowing someone else is holding you up. With his sister's endless sacrifices, he finished his studies, found work in a city, and slowly built his career. He started to earn well. He started to dress differently, speak differently, and move in circles that his sister could never have imagined for herself. And Sana watched all of this with pride. Every letter he wrote home, every story of his success, felt like a victory she had earned with her own blood and sweat. She would show his achievements to neighbors with the pride of a mother. But success can change people. Or maybe it doesn't change them. Maybe it simply reveals them. The boy who once promised to take care of his sister grew into a man who found new priorities, new loyalties, and new definitions of what mattered. At first, Sana did not notice it. When he came home less often, she told herself he was busy. When his tone grew shorter, she excused it as stress. When he started to send less money, she said it was temporary. She had always been the one to forgive, to understand, to carry the heavier load, and so it was natural for her to explain away the small cracks that began to appear in their bond. The real break came not suddenly, but slowly, like a piece of cloth fraying thread by thread, until one day it cannot hold together anymore. Imran met a woman. Her name was Hina. She was beautiful, charming, and from a family with influence. Unlike Sana, who carried herself in quiet, modest dignity, Hina moved with confidence, dressed in the latest fashion, and spoke in a tone that made people pay attention. Imran fell in love with her, or at least with the idea of what she represented: status, respect, and a doorway into a higher social circle. When he told Sana about Hina, her first reaction was happiness. After all, she had given up her own marriage prospects for him. It only made sense that he should find joy where she had denied herself. She welcomed the thought of a sister-in-law, someone who might bring new life into their small family. She prayed, silently, that this woman would understand what she had given up for Imran, and that she would join hands with her in protecting and caring for him. But Hina was not that kind of woman. From the very first meeting, Sana sensed it. There was a certain coldness in her smile, a sharpness in her words that she disguised with politeness, but couldn't fully hide. She looked at Sana not as a sister, not even as a person to respect, but as a shadow, someone whose sacrifices were irrelevant now that she, Hina, had become the center of Imran's world. The marriage happened quickly. Imran was swept away in the celebrations, in the new life opening before him, and from the very first day, Sana's place in his home, in his heart, and in his life began to shrink. Hina made sure of it. Small things at first, suggestions that Sana's presence in their house was uncomfortable, remarks about how she dressed, subtle reminders that she was an unmarried woman living in a married couple's home. Imran, instead of protecting his sister, began to echo those thoughts. The boy who had once clung to her hand now stood beside his wife, nodding at her words. It is one thing to be betrayed by a stranger, but it is entirely another to be betrayed by the person you built your entire life around. Sana tried to adjust. She tried to swallow her pain and convince herself that this was just a phase. She told herself that marriage changes people, that he would come around, but each day, his loyalty tilted more toward his wife and away from her. When conflicts arose, as they often do in families, he chose Hina's side without hesitation. When Sana voiced her hurt, he silenced her, sometimes with harsh words, sometimes with cold indifference that cut deeper than any argument ever could. Neighbors began to whisper, "After all she did for him, look at how he treats her now," they said. Sana heard the whispers, but she never replied. Her dignity would not allow her to expose her pain to the world. She held it inside, carried it like she had carried every burden in her life. But inside, something began to change. The sister, who had once lived only for her brother, began to see him clearly, not as the boy she raised, but as the man he had chosen to become. And what she saw was betrayal, ingratitude, and cruelty wrapped in silence. That was the beginning of her revenge. Not loud, not quick, not cruel. Calm revenge is different. It waits, it watches. It grows like a seed planted in the dark, watered not by rage but by the steady knowledge that justice must come. Sana did not plot dramatic actions. She did not shout or scream. She simply began to step back, to change the rhythm of her life in ways that neither her brother nor his wife noticed at first. But each small choice she made was a step on the path toward her quiet, deliberate rebalancing of the scales. And so the story turns from sacrifice to silence, from heartbreak to resolve. What Sana would eventually do, how she would transform her own pain into a calm form of revenge, is something that takes time to unfold. And perhaps that is why her story is worth telling in such detail. Because real revenge, the kind that lasts, is not built in a day. It is built slowly, in the same way a heart is broken, thread by thread, moment by moment, until finally, the shape of it cannot be ignored anymore. Sana's silence was not weakness, though to anyone watching from the outside it might have looked that way. She did not fight with her brother or his wife. She did not argue loudly, nor did she try to prove her worth to people who had already chosen to overlook it. Instead, she turned inward. In her quiet hours, she began to ask herself the questions she had long avoided. What had her life been worth, if everything she gave could be erased by a single woman's arrival? What was the value of her years of sacrifice, if her brother could discard her so easily? It is in those moments when a person finally strips away their illusions that clarity begins to appear. Sana realized something she had never allowed herself to admit. She had lived not for herself, but entirely for her brother. Every decision, every sacrifice, every ounce of her energy had been poured into him, and now she was left with nothing. He had a career, a wife, a home, and a new identity. She had only memories of the years she gave up, and a heart that felt hollow. This realization could have broken her. For many it might have, but instead it lit something inside her. If she had survived the loneliness of her parents' death, if she had raised her brother from boyhood to manhood without breaking, then surely she could survive this betrayal too. And more than that, she could learn to live differently. She could learn to live for herself. Her revenge, though she never called it that in her own mind, began here. It was not about hurting him. It was not about making Hina jealous or exposing their cruelty to the world. It was about withdrawing the part of herself that had been their foundation. Quietly, steadily, she began to take herself back. The first steps were small. She found a new job, one that paid modestly but gave her independence. For years she had depended on the little support Imran sent, but now she no longer asked for anything. When he noticed and asked casually if she needed help, she simply said, "No, I'm managing." Her tone was polite, her face calm, but inside, it was a declaration. For the first time in decades, she was not leaning on him. At first, Imran did not realize the shift. He was too busy with his new life, too wrapped up in the rhythm of his wife's world. Hina too dismissed Sana's independence as irrelevant, but over time, small details began to show. Sana no longer waited by the phone for his calls. She no longer rushed to his home when invited. She no longer made herself available to soothe their arguments or care for their household when they traveled. She was polite, she was present when required, but she was no longer the silent servant of their comfort. Instead, she built her own circle. She began tutoring children again, not out of necessity this time, but out of choice. Parents admired her patience and wisdom, and soon she became a trusted figure in the community. The little money she earned was hers alone, and she spent it on herself. New clothes, small gifts, books she had always wanted to read but never allowed herself to buy. For the first time in her adult life, she felt the taste of selfhood. Her absence, though subtle, created a shift in Imran's life. He had grown used to her presence as a constant, a safety net that asked for nothing. When she stepped back, gaps appeared. At first, he did not admit it, but he noticed. When conflicts with Hina grew sharper, he found he had no one to confide in. When he fell ill, there was no sister rushing to care for him. When he struggled at work, there was no quiet voice encouraging him in the background. He had his wife, but her support was conditional, tied to her own pride and needs. What Sana had given him had been unconditional, invisible, and now it was gone. But Sana's revenge was not meant to make him suffer directly. It was meant to restore balance in her own heart, and yet, life has a way of letting justice play itself out when someone refuses to see the truth. One evening, Imran visited her. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who was no longer as certain as he once was. He sat in her small sitting room, glancing around at the simple but warm space she had created for herself. There were books neatly stacked, a pot of tea on the stove, children's drawings pinned to a corkboard from her students. It was a home, not grand but alive with her presence. He looked at her and said, almost as if it was a casual thought, "You seem different these days." She smiled, calm and steady, and replied, "I've just been focusing on myself." He nodded, but inside, the words unsettled him. For years her life had been defined by him. Now, she was saying, without accusation, without anger, that she had found something beyond him. Hina, too, began to notice. There was a kind of dignity in Sana's presence now, a quiet strength that could not be ignored. For years she had dismissed Sana as a relic of her husband's past, an unmarried sister who had no real place in their future. But now, seeing her independence, her respect in the community, she began to feel something unfamiliar. Unease. The woman she had once belittled was no longer standing in the shadows. She was building her own light, and people were drawn to it. What makes calm revenge powerful is that it does not shout. It does not demand recognition. It simply exists, and in existing, it forces others to see what they once refused to see. Sana's dignity became the mirror in which Imran and Hina had to face themselves. As the months passed, cracks in their marriage deepened. Imran's blind loyalty to Hina no longer seemed as certain. Arguments grew sharper, fueled by the realization that he had alienated the one person who had loved him without condition. He tried in small ways to bridge the distance with Sana, but she did not rush to meet him halfway. She remained calm, polite, and self-contained. She would offer him tea, ask about his work, but there was no longer the deep devotion in her eyes. What he once took for granted was gone, and he could not demand it back. And this, more than any direct act of revenge, was the turning point. For the first time in his life, Imran understood what it meant to lose her. Not because she had walked away in anger, but because she had quietly reclaimed herself. It is one thing to be shouted at, to be accused. In those cases, a person can argue back, justify, defend, but when the person you betrayed simply steps back with calm strength, there is nothing to argue with. There is only silence, and the weight of your own choices pressing down on you. Sana never gloated. She never threw his past words in his face, never reminded him of the promises he broke. She didn't need to. Her calmness was its own reminder. Her quiet presence, unbent by bitterness, carried more weight than anger ever could. Still, her journey was not easy. At night, when she was alone, the ache of betrayal still pressed against her chest. She missed the brother she once knew, the boy who had promised to take care of her. She grieved not just for the love she lost, but for the years of her own life that she could never get back. But even in those moments, she reminded herself, grief is not weakness. It is proof that you cared, and caring is never wasted, even when it is unreturned. In the stillness of those nights, she also discovered something else: peace. For the first time, she was not waiting for someone else to change. She was not begging for love, not sacrificing herself for approval. She was simply living, quietly, with dignity. That was her revenge, not to destroy, but to rise above, to live in a way that proved her worth was never tied to anyone else's recognition. Imran and Hina's story, however, was still unfolding. And in the way life often works, their choices began to catch up with them. But that part of the story, the way their marriage twisted under the weight of its own cracks, the way Imran slowly realized the cost of his betrayal, would take time to reveal itself. For now, what mattered was this: Sana had taken the first steps of her calm revenge. By reclaiming herself, she had shifted the balance of power without lifting her voice, without lifting her hand, and in doing so, she had set into motion the quiet justice that life itself would carry forward. Time has a way of revealing truths we try to bury. For Imran, the truth of his choices began to unfold slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. He had thought that marriage would elevate him, that his wife's presence would secure his place in the world. He had believed that pushing his sister aside would prove his loyalty as a husband. But loyalty built on betrayal cannot stand for long. And in the quiet corners of his life, he began to see cracks he could not ignore. Hina was clever, beautiful, and commanding. But she was also demanding. In the early days of their marriage, her confidence had thrilled him. She walked into rooms and drew attention. She spoke with certainty about things he had never dared to voice. But over time, her confidence sharpened into criticism, her charm into control. He could never do enough, never provide enough, never rise high enough to satisfy the image she carried of the life she believed she deserved. When he tried to lean on her in moments of weakness, she pulled away. When he wanted comfort, he found only expectations. The unconditional love his sister once gave, the kind that asked for nothing in return, was nowhere to be found in his marriage. And though he would not admit it openly, he missed it. He missed her, but Sana was no longer waiting. She still spoke to him when he visited, still poured him a cup of tea, still smiled politely. Yet something had shifted permanently. Her love had been steady, selfless, and complete once. But his betrayal had burned away the illusion that he would ever return it. What remained was respect, civility, but no longer the devotion he once relied on. He had lost something he could not name but could feel, and that loss gnawed at him quietly. Meanwhile, Sana's life blossomed in unexpected ways. The children she tutored adored her, and their parents began to speak of her not as a woman who had sacrificed too much, but as a woman of wisdom and strength. She became someone people turned to for advice, someone whose calm presence reassured them. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her brother's ambitions, but now, she was building an identity of her own. Her financial independence grew. One of the children's fathers, impressed with her patience and skill, offered her a permanent position in a small private school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it gave her purpose. With her earnings, she improved her home, bought things she had once denied herself, and even saved enough to plan small trips. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream, not for someone else, but for herself. And this was the essence of her revenge: to live well, to live fully, while the ones who had betrayed her began to feel the emptiness of their own choices. She never needed to speak against them. Her life itself became the quiet rebuke. The turning point came one evening when Imran arrived unexpectedly at her home. He looked tired, worn down in a way she had never seen before. Hina's sharp voice was absent, but its echo seemed to hang around him. He sat down heavily and said nothing for a long while. Sana watched him, waiting, calm as always. Finally he spoke. "Appa," he said, his voice low. Do you ever feel like you made the wrong choices?" The question startled her, though her face did not show it. She looked at him carefully and asked, "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought, standing by my wife, building this life, it was what I was supposed to do. But sometimes—" His voice trailed off. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. His silence carried the weight of his regret. Sana said nothing. She did not remind him of the nights she had stayed awake stitching clothes to pay for his books. She did not bring up the proposals she had refused for his sake. She did not repeat the words he had once spoken, promises of taking care of her. She let the silence stretch, and in that silence, he heard everything she did not say. That was her revenge. Not in scolding him, not in shaming him, but in letting him sit in the quiet truth of his own heart. Nothing she could have said would have been as powerful as the mirror of his own regret. In the months that followed, Imran's visits grew more frequent. Sometimes he brought small gifts, as though trying to rebuild what had been lost. Sometimes he simply sat, hoping her presence would soothe him. But Sana no longer allowed herself to be his crutch. She remained kind, but firm in her independence. She offered him tea, but not her soul. She listened, but she did not bend. Hina noticed this change too. She saw that her husband's eyes no longer looked at her with the same blind devotion. She saw the way he lingered in his sister's modest home, where peace lived, while their own house felt sharp with arguments. Her unease grew, though she would never admit it out loud. And here lay the heart of Sana's calm revenge. Without raising her voice, without planning elaborate schemes, she became the quiet center of truth in their lives. The more Imran drifted between the harshness of his marriage and the calm dignity of his sister, the more he felt the consequences of his betrayal. The wife he had chosen over his sister became the source of his unrest, while the sister he had abandoned became the mirror of the peace he had thrown away. Life, too, added its own weight. Imran's career, once so promising, began to falter. Business decisions failed, colleagues turned competitive, and the security he had once flaunted slipped through his fingers. In those moments, when he needed strength the most, he realized he had cut himself off from the one person who would have stood beside him without condition. His wife criticized him. His sister simply lived on, steady and calm, her life no longer tied to his. Sana did not gloat when she heard of his struggles. She did not rejoice in his pain. That was never her intention. Her revenge was not about causing him suffering. It was about showing him, and perhaps showing herself, that she was whole without him. That his betrayal did not define the rest of her life. That she could stand alone, and in standing alone, she could rise. Years later, when neighbors spoke of Sana, they no longer described her as the sister who gave everything for her brother. They spoke of her as a respected teacher, a woman of dignity, a woman who had built her own life. Her story became an example for other women in the town, a reminder that sacrifice is noble, but self-respect is essential. Imran, meanwhile, carried his regret quietly. He never left his wife, but the joy of his marriage had long since dimmed. He visited his sister often, trying in small ways to mend what could not be fully repaired. She welcomed him politely, with warmth even, but the old devotion was gone. That, more than anything, was the price of his betrayal. To know that he had lost something pure, and that no effort could ever restore it. Sana's calm revenge was complete not in an act, but in a life. By choosing herself, by living with dignity, she had shown her brother that love cannot be discarded without cost. She had proven that silence, patience, and independence could be more powerful than anger. And in the end, she found peace. Not because he changed, but because she did. When people ask what revenge looks like, they often imagine dramatic scenes, heated words, or grand gestures. But sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply to live well, to grow in strength, and to let time itself reveal the truth. That is what Sana did. She chose calmness over chaos, dignity over bitterness, and self-respect over dependence. And in doing so, she won in the quietest, yet most undeniable way. So if you ever find yourself betrayed by the one you trusted most, remember her story. Remember that revenge does not always mean destruction. Sometimes the calmest path, the path of rebuilding yourself, of living with dignity, of finding peace within, is the strongest revenge of all. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to this story of calm revenge. If you found meaning in it, if it resonated with you, I invite you to support this channel. Please like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear this, and subscribe to My Calm Revenge for more stories told in this thoughtful, quiet way. Your support helps us bring more of these voices to life.